She thought she had found the perfect babysitter for her son. But when dark secrets begin to surface, she has to face the terrible truth. Will she be able to protect her child in time? Subscribe and write where are you watching this video from. The large windows of Celia Morgan's apartment overlooked the bustling city skyline, but the view for once did not seem to captivate her. The sight of glass buildings stretching out into the horizon, a sea of people scurrying through the streets below, did not match the growing unease in her chest. She leaned against the window frame, her gaze distant, thoughts far removed from the everyday business dealings that defined her life. Celia had worked hard to build the life she now led, a successful restaurant owner in one of the most prestigious districts in the city, constantly busy with meetings, catering events, and strategic decisions. Her name was well known, respected. She was a woman who had it all, at least on the surface. But her achievements felt empty when she thought of her son, Jason. At 8 years old, Jason was a quiet, introspective child, withdrawn into himself more than Celia had ever hoped for. His disability, a rare condition that limited his physical abilities, kept him isolated in many ways. Unlike the other children she saw at the park, he could not run, jump, or even walk for long periods without feeling exhausted. His body betrayed him daily, making the simple pleasures of childhood something he could only watch from the window, as though he were an observer in his own life. Celia often found herself caught between the demands of her business and her desire to be there for Jason. She had tried to balance her work with motherhood, but no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. She had hired a weekend nanny to help, but there were still too many moments when she couldn't be present when her son needed her most. Jason deserved more than a mother who was always rushing from one meeting to the next, more than a mother who couldn't always promise to be there when he felt scared or lonely. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was failing him. So today, as she sat at her desk in her home office surrounded by invoices and appointment books, she had made a decision. It had taken time, but Celia had come to realize that hiring a full-time nanny was the only way forward. Jason needed someone who could be with him, someone who could offer the constant support she was unable to provide. But this time she would be careful. She needed someone who understood her son's needs, someone who wouldn't treat him like a charity case or assume his disability defined him. Her phone buzzed on the desk and she glanced at the screen. A message from her assistant confirmed that Melissa Thompson was on her way. Melissa was a candidate for the full-time nanny position. The references had been glowing, the interviews promising. She had a calm, reassuring demeanor, and, most importantly, she had experience working with children with disabilities. Celia took a deep breath, smoothing her suit jacket before walking to the door. Today was the day that would change everything for Jason. Melissa arrived promptly, a soft smile on her face, her blonde hair neatly tied back. Her professional attire was understated but neat, and she carried a sense of warmth that immediately put Celia at ease. They shook hands, and Melissa introduced herself with a clear, friendly tone. Celia appreciated that she was straightforward, but there was something more, an almost palpable kindness in the way she carried herself. It felt, for the first time in months, like Celia could relax. They sat down in the living room, a bright space filled with bookshelves and art. Celia studied Melissa closely, asking questions about her background, her experience, and how she would handle situations where Jason needed extra care. Melissa answered every question with ease, her calm voice unwavering. "I've worked with children with all kinds of needs," Melissa said, "but what matters most is that they feel seen. Jason's disability doesn't define him, and neither should anyone else. I want to help him live as independently as possible. We'll focus on his strengths and work together on the areas that are more challenging for him." Celia felt a wave of relief. This was the person she had been looking for. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She was still wary. Was she being naive? Had she truly found someone she could trust with Jason's care? But for now, the feeling in her chest was one of cautious optimism. Melissa would be a good fit. As the interview drew to a close, Melissa stood to leave, her smile kind but professional. She told Celia that she would start the following Monday. She promised to take care of Jason as if he were her own son. Celia nodded, the anxiety that had gripped her for the past few days beginning to dissipate. She watched Melissa leave, her heart settling into a place of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would work. Jason was sitting in his favorite spot by the window when Melissa arrived on her first day. The moment she stepped through the door, he turned to look at her with the wary eyes of someone who had seen too many strangers come and go. Jason didn't have the same level of trust as other children. His disability made him feel vulnerable, and people had often treated him with a mixture of pity and expectation. He didn't want to be someone's project. Melissa didn't approach him immediately. She gave him space, watching him carefully but without judgment. "Hi, Jason," she said gently, as if testing the waters. "I'm Melissa. I'm going to be helping you with whatever you need today. We can do whatever you like." Jason stared at her for a long moment before turning back to the window. He didn't speak. Celia, who had been watching from the hallway, felt a twinge of discomfort. She had hoped for a more immediate connection, but she understood. Jason was shy around new people, especially adults who didn't always understand him. Melissa sat nearby, unperturbed. She didn't push him. Instead, she started to play with a set of building blocks on the table, quietly inviting him into her world. After a few minutes, she spoke again, her tone light. "Want to see if we can make the tallest tower? I bet you can do it." Jason, still hesitant, glanced at her from the corner of his eye. For a moment, she thought he might decline, but then, slowly, he reached for a block. He didn't say anything, but Melissa smiled inwardly. He was taking the first step. The afternoon passed in this way, with Jason and Melissa working together on different tasks. She showed him how to complete simple puzzles, encouraged him to try a new art project, and gently steered him when he grew frustrated. The more time they spent together, the more Jason's walls started to lower. He began to speak a little more, though it was still hard for him to make eye contact. Melissa was patient, letting him dictate the pace. As Celia watched from the doorway, she felt a sense of relief that was almost foreign to her. She could see Jason responding to Melissa in ways he hadn't done before. There was no sense of forcefulness, no underlying pity in Melissa's voice. She was simply there to help him, to see him for who he was. Jason needed that more than anything. By the end of the afternoon, Jason had even smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. "I think you two are going to get along just fine," Celia said softly, her voice full of unspoken gratitude. Melissa nodded, her smile warm and understanding. As the evening wore on and Melissa gathered her things to leave, Celia felt the familiar tug of guilt. She had made the right choice, but leaving her son in someone else's care still felt like an impossibly difficult decision. She had wanted to be the one to give him everything he needed, but maybe this was the first step toward both of them finding peace. Jason looked up as Melissa made her way toward the door. "See you tomorrow," she said with a smile. Jason nodded, his small, fragile body still stiff with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long while, Celia saw something she hadn't expected, a glimmer of hope in her son's eyes. Maybe, just maybe, everything was about to change. The days following Melissa's arrival brought a quiet sense of relief to Celia. It had been weeks since she'd felt this weight lift from her shoulders, the weight of guilt, the constant anxiety of whether her son was okay, the worry that she wasn't doing enough. Melissa seemed to fit into their lives seamlessly. She was patient with Jason, and he, in turn, was beginning to open up in small but meaningful ways. For the first time in a long while, Celia allowed herself to feel a sense of calm as she went about her daily routine. The restaurant was bustling as always, and her schedule was packed with meetings and events. But in the evenings, when she returned home, there was a new peace that settled over her, a feeling that Jason was in good hands. But the cracks, they were small at first, almost imperceptible, began to show soon enough. It started with the little things, the subtle shifts in tone when Melissa spoke to Jason. She would say things like, "Why do you walk so slowly? You should be able to do this by now." Or, "Is it really that hard to finish this task?" The words were sharp, like tiny cuts to Celia's consciousness, but at first she brushed them off. It could be the stress of getting used to a new routine, or maybe Jason was just being difficult. But then there were the looks Melissa would give him when he struggled. Sometimes, when Jason couldn't do something as easily as she thought he should, Melissa would sigh, a soft, almost imperceptible noise that sent an uncomfortable ripple through the room. She would try to hide it with a smile, but there was always something in her eyes, a glint of frustration, a flicker of something darker. Celia caught these moments during her brief visits home, watching from a distance when she thought Melissa and Jason didn't notice. She wasn't sure why, but the hair on the back of her neck stood up when she saw those looks. She had tried to brush it off, telling herself that perhaps it was just a misunderstanding, that Melissa was just trying to be firm, to help Jason push through the challenges he faced every day. But one evening, when Celia returned home early from a meeting, she saw something that made her stomach twist with unease. Jason had been sitting at the kitchen table, trying to work on a drawing. He had always loved art, and it was one of the few things that brought him joy. He was concentrating hard, his small brow furrowed in focus as he held his pencil carefully over the paper. But something had gone wrong. The lines weren't straight, or the colors didn't blend the way he wanted them to. His frustration was palpable, and Celia watched as he put down his pencil, letting out a deep sigh. Melissa, who had been standing nearby, watched him with an intensity that made Celia's heart skip a beat. She had a quiet smile on her face, but her eyes, there was something about the way she was looking at him that made Celia's skin crawl. She had seen that look before, in moments of discomfort when someone was pushing just a little too hard, expecting a little too much. It was the same look that made her feel like an outsider at times, the look of someone who didn't understand the struggles of others, who expected too much from a person who already felt like they were fighting against their own body. And then, without any warning, Melissa spoke. Her voice, though soft, was cold. "You can do better than this, Jason," she said, her tone clipped. "Why are you making this so hard on yourself?" Jason flinched at the words, his small shoulders stiffening as if he had been slapped. He didn't respond, just sat there, looking down at the paper. It was as if he was trying to make himself smaller, to hide from the harshness of her tone. Celia's heart broke as she watched him. She could see the tension in his body, the way he was pulling away, retreating further into himself. "Melissa," Celia said, stepping forward, "is everything okay here?" Melissa immediately turned her attention to her smile returning as if nothing had happened. "Oh, it's fine, Celia. Jason is just having a hard time focusing today. I was encouraging him to do better, that's all." Celia's gaze flickered between Melissa and Jason. There was something about the exchange that felt off, as though Melissa's words didn't match her actions. Jason wasn't a lazy child. He wasn't refusing to try. But his disability meant that things didn't come easily to him, and Melissa seemed to forget that too often. Celia wasn't sure how to react. She wanted to trust Melissa. She had to trust her, but the unease inside her chest was growing, slowly but surely. She had seen the way Jason was withdrawn into himself, the way his joy was slowly being replaced by a quiet sense of defeat. It wasn't just in moments like this. Over the past few days, she had noticed subtle changes in Jason's behavior. He had become quieter, retreating more into himself when Melissa was around. He would no longer eagerly tell her about his day when she came home from work. Instead, he would sit in silence, his eyes dull, as if he had lost interest in everything that used to matter to him. At first, Celia had thought it was just a phase. Jason was adjusting to a new person in his life after all. But the more she watched, the more she started to see patterns, things she couldn't ignore. One night, when she was tucking Jason into bed, she noticed that his usual smile was nowhere to be found. His eyes were heavy, as though the weight of the day had pressed him down, and his lips were set in a thin line. "Jason," she said softly, brushing his hair from his forehead, "how was your day?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted under the covers, staring at the ceiling. Celia's heart sank. She knew that silence. It was the silence of a child who had been hurt, who didn't know how to speak up. "Jason, sweetheart, talk to me. Was everything okay with Melissa?" she asked, her voice quiet but insistent. His eyes flickered to hers, and for a brief moment, she saw a flash of fear, of something unspoken. "I don't want to talk about it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Celia felt her stomach twist. Something wasn't right. She kissed him on the forehead, and without saying another word, she stood up, her mind racing. She had to get to the bottom of this. She had to protect him. Over the next few days, Celia kept a closer eye on Melissa's interactions with Jason. She watched them from the hallway, peering around corners when she thought they wouldn't notice. What she saw only confirmed her growing suspicions. There were more sharp comments, more harsh words. Jason's responses became quieter, more withdrawn. He didn't argue with Melissa anymore. He didn't even try to explain himself. And yet, every time Celia asked Melissa about it, she was met with reassuring smiles and claims that everything was fine. Melissa was simply pushing him to do better, she would say. But Celia wasn't convinced. Something was wrong. And for the first time since Melissa had come into their lives, Celia was scared. Celia woke up to the muffled sounds of Jason's quiet movements in his room. The first rays of morning light filtered through the blinds, and for a brief moment, everything seemed serene. But as she sat up in bed, the growing weight in her chest reminded her of the unease that had crept into her home. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Melissa, once the perfect candidate, now cast a long shadow over their lives, one that Celia couldn't ignore any longer. Jason's behavior had shifted, subtly at first, but now glaringly obvious. The joy that once lit up his face when she walked into the room had been replaced with a distant stare. His once bubbly laughter was rare, replaced with quiet compliance. Celia had tried to convince herself that the transition to a full-time nanny was just taking its toll on him, that he was adjusting. But the lingering fear in his eyes and the uncharacteristic silence that followed him like a second skin told her otherwise. It was a Saturday morning when Celia first noticed the bruises. She had planned to spend the day with Jason, hoping to distract him from whatever was troubling him and to rebuild their bond. Jason sat at the breakfast table, slowly picking at his plate of scrambled eggs. His posture was slouched, his head low, as if the weight of the world rested on his small shoulders. Celia sat across from him, sipping her coffee, studying him closely. Something about the way he held himself seemed off, as though he was trying to hide. "Jason," she began, keeping her tone light, "how about we go to the park today? It's been a while since we had a day just for us." Jason didn't respond immediately. He poked at his eggs, his fork scraping against the plate. Finally, he looked up at her, and for the first time, Celia noticed a faint purple mark near his wrist, just barely visible beneath the sleeve of his long-sleeved shirt. Her heart sank. "Jason, what's that on your arm?" she asked, setting her mug down and leaning forward. Jason froze. He quickly pulled his sleeve down, hiding the mark. "It's nothing, Mom," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Celia frowned, her gaze fixed on him. "Jason, show me your arm. Please." He hesitated, his small hand clutching the fabric of his sleeve tightly. Celia's tone softened, her heart breaking as she saw the fear in his eyes. "Sweetheart, you can tell me. I'm here to help." Slowly, reluctantly, Jason rolled up his sleeve, revealing not just one but several bruises of varying shades scattered across his forearm. Celia's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, gently touching the bruises, her mind racing. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How did you get these?" Jason pulled his arm back, cradling it close to his chest. I fell," he stammered. "It's not a big deal." Celia knew he was lying. Jason was many things, but he was not clumsy. The placement of the bruises didn't make sense for a simple fall. They were too deliberate, too precise. Her stomach churned as a terrible thought crossed her mind, one she didn't want to believe. Later that evening, Celia found herself pacing the living room. Jason was asleep in his room, his small frame curled up under the blankets. She had spent the entire day trying to coax more information out of him, but he had remained tight-lipped, insisting that nothing was wrong. But Celia knew her son. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way he flinched at the slightest noise. Her mind kept circling back to Melissa. Could she have done this? The woman who had seemed so perfect, so kind and understanding. Was it possible that she had a darker side? Celia hated herself for even thinking it, but the evidence was mounting. She couldn't ignore the changes in Jason's behavior, the bruises, the way he seemed to shrink in Melissa's presence. The next day, Celia decided to confront Melissa directly. She waited until Jason was in his room, playing quietly, before calling Melissa into the kitchen. The nanny appeared calm, as always, her professional demeanor intact. "Melissa, I need to talk to you," Celia began, crossing her arms over her chest. "I noticed some bruises on Jason's arm yesterday. He says he fell, but I'm not sure I believe him." Melissa's expression didn't falter. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes wide with what appeared to be concern. "Oh, Celia, I'm so sorry to hear that. Jason has been struggling with his coordination lately. He's had a few little tumbles, but I didn't think it was anything serious. I should have told you." Celia studied her closely, searching for any sign of deceit. "Tumbles?" she repeated. Jason isn't clumsy. He doesn't just fall. Melissa's smile faltered for a split second before she quickly recovered. Sometimes, children with disabilities like Jason's can have accidents. I'll be more careful in the future to watch him closely. Celia nodded slowly, but the pit in her stomach didn't go away. Something about Melissa's explanation didn't sit right with her. It felt too rehearsed, too polished. But without concrete evidence, what could she do? That night, as Celia tucked Jason into bed, she noticed he seemed unusually tense. She sat down on the edge of his bed, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Jason," she said softly, "you know you can tell me anything, right? If something is bothering you, or if someone is hurting you, I need to know." Jason's eyes welled up with tears, but he quickly turned his head away, burying his face in his pillow. "I'm fine, Mom," he mumbled, his voice muffled. Celia's heart broke all over again. She leaned down, kissing his forehead. "I love you, Jason. You're the most important thing in the world to me. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. Always." As she left his room, closing the door softly behind her, Celia knew she couldn't wait any longer. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The following morning, Celia set up a meeting with Jason's pediatrician. She brought Jason in for a routine checkup, but her true purpose was to get an expert's opinion on the bruises. The doctor examined Jason carefully, asking gentle questions about how he had gotten the marks. Jason's answers were vague, his gaze fixed on the floor. After the examination, the doctor pulled Celia aside. "The bruises aren't consistent with a fall," she said quietly. "They're more indicative of physical force, like someone grabbing him. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if you suspect anything, it's worth investigating further." Celia felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. The confirmation she had dreaded was now staring her in the face. She thanked the doctor, her mind racing with what to do next. When they returned home, Celia sat Jason down at the kitchen table. She took his small hands in hers, looking him directly in the eyes. "Jason," she said gently, "I need you to tell me the truth. Did Melissa hurt you?" Jason's lower lip trembled and tears spilled down his cheeks. He nodded, his small frame shaking as he finally let out the truth he had been holding in. "She gets mad at me when I can't do things right," he sobbed. "She grabs me, and sometimes she hits me. I didn't want to tell you because I was scared." Celia pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as he cried into her shoulder. Her own tears streamed down her face as anger and guilt consumed her. How could she have let this happen? How had she missed the signs? But there was no time for self-blame. Celia knew what she had to do. She needed to protect Jason at all costs. This was no longer just about trust. It was about justice. The air in Celia's apartment felt heavier than ever, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. The previous evening's confrontation with Jason had shattered any illusions she might have had about Melissa. As Jason slept peacefully, unaware of the storm that was brewing, Celia knew that the only way forward was to face the ugly truth head-on. But she couldn't do it alone. She had to dig deeper, find the proof, and make sure that Jason would never have to face Melissa's cruelty again. The first thing Celia did the following morning was contact a private investigator. She had no time to waste. Jason's safety was her priority, and she needed more than just his word to take action. The investigator, a seasoned professional named Roger, agreed to meet with her in person. She explained everything: her suspicions about Melissa, the bruises on Jason, the unexplained shifts in her son's behavior. Roger listened carefully, his expression unreadable as he took notes. "I'll need to set up surveillance," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's the best way to get solid evidence. I'll have someone in place within the hour." Celia nodded, feeling a surge of relief mixed with anxiety. She had 1,000 questions, but she trusted Roger. He had done this kind of work before, and she needed results. As he left to begin his work, Celia went into Jason's room. She sat on the edge of his bed, watching him sleep. Her heart ached for him. She couldn't imagine what he had been through, what he was still processing, but she promised herself that this would end. No one, not even someone she had trusted so completely, could hurt her son and get away with it. It wasn't long before Celia received the first piece of evidence, a series of disturbing images captured by a hidden camera installed by Roger's team. At first, the footage was grainy, the lighting poor, but the content was undeniable. In one clip, Melissa was seen dragging Jason by his arm across the living room, her grip so tight that his small body staggered to keep up. The boy looked terrified, trying to free himself from her hold, but Melissa's strength seemed to overpower him. In another video, Melissa was shouting at Jason, forcing him to stand in the corner for what seemed like an eternity, even though he was clearly exhausted. The sound was muffled, but Celia could tell that Melissa was scolding him harshly. Jason's shoulders slumped in defeat, and his head hung low as he endured the punishment. In the background, the clock ticked, marking the passing time. How long had this been going on? How long had Melissa been allowed to terrorize her son without Celia knowing? The worst footage came the next day. Melissa, in a fit of rage, shoved Jason onto the couch after he couldn't follow her instructions. She had screamed at him for something minor, perhaps for dropping a toy or moving too slowly. In the footage, Jason winced as he hit the arm of the couch, and Melissa's hand shot out, pushing him again, this time harder. Jason's small body recoiled, but he didn't fight back. He couldn't. Celia felt sick to her stomach. It was as though the ground beneath her had disappeared, and the world had turned into something unrecognizable, something dangerous. The next step was to confront the neighbors. Celia hadn't spoken to them much, save for brief greetings in passing, but now she needed to know what they had seen, what they might have overheard. She decided to visit them one by one, hoping for any clue that could confirm her worst fears. Mrs. Carmichael, a middle-aged woman who lived next door, was the first to answer her door. She'd always been friendly with Celia, but today there was something more cautious in her demeanor. After exchanging pleasantries, Celia brought up the topic she dreaded most. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, but have you noticed anything unusual in my apartment recently? About Melissa or Jason?" she asked hesitantly. Mrs. Carmichael looked down, as if weighing her words carefully. I've heard things," she said finally, her voice low. "Sometimes at night I hear yelling, muffled at first, but then it gets louder. I wasn't sure if it was just the TV, but one night I heard a crash. It was so loud that it startled me." She paused, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "I've seen Melissa a few times, dragging Jason out of the apartment too. She had a tight grip on his arm, and he didn't look happy about it. I thought it was just discipline, but it didn't feel right." Celia felt her heart race, and she nodded. "Thank you for telling me. Is there anything else you remember? Anything at all?" Mrs. Carmichael shook her head, her eyes filled with regret. "I wish I'd said something sooner. I just didn't know what to do." Celia gave her a tight smile. You did the right thing. Thank you." Next, she visited a young couple on the other side of the building. Their door opened to reveal a man in his early 30s, his face creased with concern as soon as Celia explained why she was there. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "We've heard shouting. Not often, but enough. And once I saw Melissa dragging Jason down the hall. He wasn't walking right, like he was struggling to keep up. She wasn't being gentle, that's for sure. It didn't sit well with me, but I didn't know what to do about it." Celia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Over the past few weeks, she had dismissed the odd feeling she'd had about Melissa as paranoia, but now it was clear that something had been horribly wrong. These neighbors, just like Mrs. Carmichael, had noticed things that Celia had been too busy or too trusting to see. By the end of the day, Celia had a stack of evidence, a collection of hidden footage, witness statements, and her own growing sense of outrage. The pieces were falling into place, and there was no turning back now. She knew what she had to do. That evening, after Jason had gone to bed, Celia made the call. She dialed the police, her hands trembling as she gave them the details. She had enough evidence now to take action. The officer on the other end of the line was calm but firm. "We'll send someone over tomorrow to take a statement and collect the footage. I'll also advise you to not confront Melissa directly until we can ensure your safety." "I understand," Celia said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I just want to make sure she can't hurt him anymore." The officer promised her that they would take swift action. As Celia ended the call, she sat in silence for a moment, staring at the phone in her hand. It was all happening so fast. Soon, Melissa would be held accountable for what she had done to Jason. The truth was out, and there would be no escaping it. But for now, all Celia could do was hold her son close and pray that he would find some peace once this nightmare was over. The morning sun filtered softly through the curtains of Celia's bedroom, casting long shadows across the floor. Despite the warmth of the light, there was a chilling sense of finality in the air. Today would be the day. Today, she would confront Melissa, face to face, with the truth. She had spent hours reviewing the evidence, piecing together the broken fragments of her trust. The hidden cameras, the testimony from the neighbors, and, most painfully of all, the undeniable confession from her own son. Everything pointed to the same horrifying reality. Melissa had been abusing Jason. Celia's heart beat with a mixture of anger, fear, and resolve. She had never imagined that the woman she had trusted, the one she had brought into her home to care for her son, could have done such things. The thought of it twisted inside her chest, gnawing at her as if her very soul was being torn apart. But there was no turning back now. She had to stand up for Jason, no matter the cost. As she prepared for the confrontation, Celia thought about how much had changed since Melissa had first come into their lives. In the beginning, she had been the perfect caregiver, gentle, professional, and always smiling. But over time, small cracks had begun to show. The strange comments, the harshness in her tone when dealing with Jason's limitations, the way she pushed him beyond his abilities without any regard for his physical or emotional needs. It had all been there. If only Celia had been paying closer attention. Now it was too late for second-guessing. All that mattered was protecting her son. The police had advised Celia to wait until they could coordinate with her, but something inside her told her that if she waited, Melissa would slip away unnoticed, just like so many abusers before her. There was a deep sense of urgency within Celia, the knowledge that her son's torment couldn't wait another day. She knew she was taking a risk by confronting Melissa alone, but the thought of waiting one more minute was unbearable. She called Melissa at 10 a.m., trying to keep her voice steady, though her hands were trembling as she held the phone to her ear. "Melissa, we need to talk," Celia said, the words cold but controlled. "Can you come over to the apartment right now?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Celia could hear the faint rustling of paper or fabric, the sound of Melissa moving around. Finally, her voice came back, calm but with an undercurrent of unease. "Of course. I'll be there in about 20 minutes. Is everything okay?" Celia's grip tightened on the phone. "No, Melissa, everything is not okay. We need to talk about Jason." 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Celia's pulse quickened, her stomach twisting into tight knots. She opened the door to find Melissa standing there, dressed neatly as always, her face carefully composed. She smiled, but it was forced, as if she could sense the tension hanging in the air. "Celia, is everything all right? What's going on? You sounded serious," Melissa said, stepping inside without waiting for Celia to invite her. Celia closed the door behind her, locking it instinctively. She didn't know why she felt the need to do that, but something about Melissa's calm demeanor felt off, like a predator waiting for the right moment to pounce. "I'll cut to the chase, Melissa," Celia said, her voice firm. "I know what's been going on with Jason. I've seen the videos, I've heard the neighbors, and I've heard from my son. You've been hurting him." Melissa's eyes widened, and for a split second the mask of composure slipped. But just as quickly she regained control, her expression turning cold and defensive. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "I don't know what you think you've seen, but you're wrong. I've been taking care of him the best way I know how." Celia took a step closer, her anger flaring. "Don't lie to me. I have everything, footage of you yelling at him, shoving him, making him stand in the corner for hours when he couldn't even move properly. I've seen the bruises on his body, Melissa. I've seen what you've done to him." Melissa's face flushed, a flicker of panic crossing her features before she quickly masked it with a dismissive laugh. "That's ridiculous. You're overreacting. I was just trying to discipline him. He's a good boy, but he needs structure. You can't just let him get away with everything because of his disability. He'll never learn." Celia's chest tightened as Melissa spoke, her words like acid dripping into her ears. "Structure? You think what you've been doing is discipline? You've been tormenting him. You've been abusing him, and you know it." For the first time, Melissa hesitated. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for words, but none seemed to come. Celia didn't give her the chance to recover. "I trusted you. I gave you my trust and my son's well-being, and you've betrayed me in the worst possible way. You've taken advantage of both of us, and now it's over." Melissa's eyes darted nervously to the door, as if considering her options. She knew the jig was up, but instead of breaking down or admitting guilt, she stood tall and folded her arms across her chest, trying to retain some semblance of control. "I was only doing what was necessary," she said, her voice growing more defiant. "You don't understand. He's weak. I was teaching him to be strong. He needs someone to push him, to show him that he can't just sit around and let his disability define him. I was helping him. You should be thanking me." Celia's hands shook, but she kept her voice steady. "No, Melissa, you weren't helping him. You were hurting him. You're not some kind of savior. You're a monster, and I'm not going to let you hurt him anymore." Melissa's face twisted into a snarl. "You're making a huge mistake. You'll regret this. He's weak, and you're just as bad as I am for letting him get away with it. You'll see." Celia's heart pounded, but she took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "No, Melissa, it's over. I'm calling the police." Melissa's eyes flickered with something dangerous, something dark. She took a step forward, her lips curling into a sneer. "You think you can just throw me away? You think I'll let you take everything I've worked for? You'll regret this, Celia. I'm not going anywhere." But it was too late. Celia had already dialed the number, and before Melissa could say another word, she heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Melissa's face twisted in disbelief as the door opened, and two officers stepped inside. Celia stood tall, her back straight, as she looked at Melissa one last time. "You're done," Celia said, her voice low but filled with an undeniable strength. The officers moved quickly, handcuffing Melissa before she could resist. The woman's defiance crumbled as she was escorted out of the apartment, her eyes wild with rage and fear. As the door slammed shut behind her, Celia let out a shaky breath. It was over. Melissa would never hurt Jason again. For the first time in months, Celia felt a glimmer of peace. She had done what was right. She had protected her son, and that was all that mattered. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Celia stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls felt like they were closing in around her, each step echoing loudly in her ears. It had been months since the day Melissa was arrested, and the trial was now underway. A sense of finality hung in the air, and Celia could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. She hadn't expected the process to be easy, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotional toll it would take. Every day since Melissa's arrest had been filled with paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and long hours spent preparing herself for what was to come. And now, here she was, about to face the woman who had betrayed her in the worst way imaginable. Jason had insisted on coming with her, though Celia had hesitated at first. He was still processing everything that had happened, still reeling from the trauma that Melissa had caused. But he had insisted on standing by his mother, offering her quiet support in the way only a child could. He had come a long way since that fateful day, and though his recovery was still ongoing, he was stronger than Celia had ever imagined he could be. Melissa, on the other hand, was seated on the opposite side of the courtroom. She had always maintained her innocence, and the smug look on her face when she had entered the room made Celia's blood boil. She had yet to admit her guilt, even after everything that had come to light. The evidence against her was overwhelming, but Melissa still clung to the belief that she had done nothing wrong. Celia took a deep breath as the trial began. The judge, a tall man with a stern expression, called the court to order. The room fell into complete silence as he instructed the attorneys to make their opening statements. Celia's lawyer, a young woman named Laura, who had been with her through every step of this ordeal, rose from her seat. Laura was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a fierce determination to see justice done. She had worked tirelessly to build the case against Melissa. Now it was time to present everything they had. "We will prove," Laura began, her voice firm, "that the defendant, Melissa Cartwright, caused significant harm to the plaintiff's son, Jason Morgan, through repeated physical and emotional abuse. The evidence we will present includes video footage, testimonies from neighbors, and medical records that show the lasting physical effects of the defendant's actions." Celia felt a surge of emotion as Laura spoke. She had witnessed the videos herself, the painful proof of Melissa's cruelty. It wasn't just the bruises and the physical injuries that had hurt Jason, though. It was the emotional trauma, the fear, the isolation that had scarred him in ways that would take years to heal. Melissa's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and an air of arrogance, stood next. He made no attempt to deny the accusations, but instead sought to shift the focus onto Celia and her parenting. "My client," he began, his tone measured and almost condescending, acted in what she believed to be the best interest of the child. Jason's condition required special care, and Melissa's methods, while perhaps unorthodox, were aimed at helping him become more independent and overcome his physical limitations. The allegations against her are exaggerated and misrepresented. Celia felt a flash of anger at his words, but she kept her emotions in check. She had learned to keep her composure throughout this process, to stay strong for Jason even when everything inside her screamed to lash out. This wasn't about her. It was about Jason and the justice he deserved. The trial proceeded with the presentation of evidence. First came the video footage, played in the courtroom for all to see. Celia's stomach turned as she watched Melissa's harsh treatment of Jason, the yelling, the shoving, the relentless demands that pushed him far beyond what he was physically capable of. It was painful to relive, but it was necessary. The truth needed to be seen. Next came the testimonies from the neighbors. Several people who had heard the sounds of yelling and distress coming from Celia's apartment had agreed to testify. They spoke of the strange, unsettling noises they had overheard, the loud, angry voices, the cries for help. One neighbor described hearing Melissa berate Jason, telling him that he was lazy and weak. Another recalled seeing Melissa drag Jason by the arm as he struggled to keep up with her. Each testimony added weight to the case, painting a vivid picture of the abuse that had taken place behind closed doors. But it was the medical records that hit hardest. The doctor who had examined Jason shortly after the abuse was discovered spoke in clear, undeniable terms about the physical evidence of trauma. Jason's injuries, the doctor explained, are consistent with the kind of abuse that occurs when a child is subjected to forceful restraint, physical punishment, and emotional neglect. These injuries were not accidental. Celia could feel her heart breaking all over again. She had tried to protect Jason from the worst of it, but hearing the details of his pain, hearing the cold, clinical description of the damage done to him, was almost too much to bear. Yet she remained resolute. She couldn't back down now, not when Jason needed her more than ever. Finally, it was Jason's turn to testify. Celia had feared this moment. He was still so young, still so fragile after everything he had been through. But Jason had insisted. He wanted to stand up for himself, to tell his story in his own words. He took the stand, his small frame barely visible behind the large wooden podium. Celia could see how nervous he was, his hands twisting together in his lap. But there was a quiet strength in his eyes, a determination to speak his truth. When the prosecutor asked Jason to describe what had happened, his voice was soft but steady. "Melissa, she made me do things I couldn't do," Jason said, his voice breaking slightly. "She told me I was slow. She made me stay in the corner for a long time, and she hit me when I didn't do things right. I didn't want to do it, but she made me." Celia's heart clenched as she heard Jason's words. She had known it, of course, but hearing it from him, seeing the pain in his eyes, was something she hadn't been prepared for. Her mind flashed back to the countless nights when she had held him close, trying to make him feel safe, trying to protect him from the horrors he had endured. She could see the scars in his eyes now, even if they weren't visible to the world. But Jason was stronger than he realized. His bravery in speaking up was a testament to his resilience. He was healing, slowly but surely. and this was the final step in his journey to freedom. Melissa sat there, her face pale, her jaw clenched as she listened to Jason's testimony. She did not cry, did not flinch, but Celia could see the cracks beginning to form in her defiance. The truth was undeniable, and no amount of lies could cover it up now. The defense attempted to discredit Jason's testimony, suggesting that he had been coached, that he was too young to understand the full scope of the situation. But the evidence spoke for itself. Melissa's actions had left a trail of destruction, and the truth was too powerful to ignore. After days of deliberation, the jury finally returned with their verdict. Celia sat nervously, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair as the judge prepared to announce the decision. "Melissa Cartwright," the judge said, his voice steady, "you are hereby found guilty of child abuse and neglect. The court hereby sentences you to 15 years in prison for your actions." The room was silent as the words sank in. Celia felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. It was over. Justice had been served. Melissa's face twisted in fury, but there was no escaping the reality of her actions. Celia didn't care about the venom in Melissa's eyes. She didn't care about the woman's hatred. What mattered was that Jason was safe now. As the courtroom emptied, Celia looked at her son, standing beside her, his small hand in hers. They had been through hell together, but now they were free. The road ahead would not be easy, but Celia knew that with Jason by her side, they could face anything. And, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that they would be okay. The trial had ended. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now stood silent, its weight heavy with the verdict. Celia sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the judge's words reverberated in her mind. Guilty. The word echoed in the air like a thunderclap. In Melissa, once the calm and composed Nanny, was now reduced to a shell of herself, shackled in the courtroom. Her stoic expression faltered for just a second, but it was enough. Celia had seen it. The faintest crack in the armor of someone who had long tried to keep up the facade of innocence. The courtroom buzzed with the chatter of reporters and spectators, but Celia felt as though she were underwater. The rush of emotions was overwhelming, but there was one thought that pierced through the haze. Jason would be safe now. Celia had spent months collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, reviewing security footage. Everything had pointed to the same grim reality. Melissa had not been a caregiver. She had been an abuser, hiding behind the mask of professionalism and kindness. Celia had done what she needed to do: protect her son. As the judge read out the sentence, years of imprisonment, Celia didn't feel the relief she had imagined. There was no joy in hearing the punishment for the woman who had hurt her son, but there was a quiet sense of finality. Justice had been served. Later, after the trial, Celia stood at the courthouse steps, her hand resting on Jason's shoulder. He was quiet, his face serious, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of peace. They were finally free. Jason had already been through so much, but today, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to smile. It wasn't a smile filled with joy or celebration, but one that showed he understood. He could now let go of the fear that had gripped him for so long. "I'm glad it's over, Mom," he said softly, his voice a little unsteady. Celia nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She pulled him into a tight hug. "Me too, baby. Me too." The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of fear, but the quiet that comes after a storm. A peace that only follows when the worst is finally behind you. When they arrived at home, Celia helped Jason unpack his backpack, the weight of the day settling around them. But even in the midst of the lingering exhaustion, Celia allowed herself a moment to look at her son and appreciate his strength. He had been through more than any child should have to bear, and yet here he was, still standing. That night, as they sat together on the couch, Celia knew that the healing would take time. There would be scars, emotional and physical, that wouldn't fade easily. But they would heal together. The wounds would be closed, one by one, as they rebuilt their lives. And in the quiet moments, like the ones they shared that evening, Celia realized that the hardest part was over. She had fought for Jason, for their family, and now they were free. Free from fear, from doubt, from the looming presence of someone who had once held so much power over them. Tomorrow would be a new day, a day of rebuilding, of rediscovering trust, of taking the first steps toward a future without shadows. As she tucked Jason into bed that night, he turned to her and whispered, "I think it's going to be okay, Mom." Celia kissed his forehead, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, baby, it's going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, Celia believed it. The nightmare was finally over. They were free. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Also, check out our other stories that will surprise you. Share this video with your friends and let them know what happened next.